There's not gonna be anything bad in here?
Just you.
Come on, Joel. Her acting wasn't that bad. Hello and welcome to HateWatchers. With the first season of The Last of Us in the books, it's time to do our complete season review for the show. Nearly 10 years ago, Naughty Dog and creative director Neil Druckmann released The Last of Us, a highly lauded story and character-driven narrative wrapped up in a zombie survival game. The game received incredible ratings across the board, while the voice actors behind Joel and Ellie, as well as the studio itself, took home boxes of awards. 10 years later, the award-winning tale of The Last of Us made its way to HBO where, reportedly, nearly $100 million was put into the production of the first season, and Neil Druckmann got his wish of working in Hollywood. And from the look of things, that $100 million was money well spent. Nearly every other video game adaptation has managed to leave both fans of the game and casual viewers underwhelmed, leading to flop after flop, and giving creators pause when considering trying to adapt a video game for the big or little screen. But The Last of Us, for now, has shirked that trend, on its way to producing a hit show that's enticed casual viewers while mostly satisfying those who are fans of the game. Of course, it wasn't a huge hill to climb given the cinematic nature of the game, but it's noteworthy nonetheless. Now, we don't think the second season will have as easy a time replicating this success, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, let's break it down and go over exactly how The Last of Us measured up in 4 critical categories, and analyze what allowed the show to successfully adapt the original game's story. In this review, we'll be evaluating the series on its overall presentation, which includes things like effects, CGI, music, sets, props, costuming, all that. How the TV show adaptation did at adhering to the existing story and lore, the acting, and finally the writing. Let's get into it, starting with the presentation. And we shouldn't need to say this, but spoilers ahead for Season 1 of The Last of Us. Not wanting to keep you in suspense, the production value and overall presentation of this show was flat out incredible. Outside of a rogue shot where they accidentally captured the film crew in one scene, we can't think of a single misstep in this category. Sure, they poured money into the show like crazy, likely spending more than $10 million an episode. But how many other shows have we seen with that type of budget that still come out looking cheap, or the creators end up overlooking all of the little details that bring the audience's ratings of the show down? I mean, Rings of Power threw cash at everything during the production of that show, but they still couldn't buy a positive review. Well, an honest review at least. They certainly bought their share of puff pieces and shield reviews. But at $58 million an episode, not once did the Rings of Power engross viewers like The Last of Us was able to more often than not. So even though they had a budget of around $100 million to work with, the creators made fantastic use of this budget to bring the whole production together, where others all too often these days take it for granted. And a point we want to reiterate was the attention paid to the detail in The Last of Us. It's such an easy thing for some people to overlook that it must be appreciated when a series puts in the time and effort to make sure all of the little things help sell the world and the story, just as much as the performances or the settings. For example, in episode 5, Joel tells Ellie to get out her gun, which she pulls from her pocket instead of from her backpack where he told Ellie to store it in the previous episode. And when Joel sees this, he has visible frustration with Ellie. It's such a small thing, but it's a completely realistic reaction. It stitches this episode together with the preceding episode, and it's the exact kind of thing that lets the viewers know that the creators and everyone involved in the production care about the art they're putting out. Or you can point to how many times Ellie is wearing the exact same outfit as she was in the game. Or the fact that we hear the 80s music from Joel's radio at the end of episode 1, and when they arrive at Bill's place, Ellie asks why the music is playing. Or Joel sleeping on his good ear when Henry and Sam get the jump on them. Or how Joel and Sarah didn't eat pancakes in the first episode, or how Joel forgot the birthday cake, or how Sarah didn't eat the cookies Mrs. Adler made, and we saw the Adlers stuffing biscuits into their grandma's mouth. So we can piece together that Joel and Sarah weren't infected by the flour supply contamination, which is revealed in the next episode. Yes, these are small details, but you can see how, in many different ways, these small things can improve how audiences perceive the show. And The Last of Us rewards you for paying attention. Now, this attention to detail could be mentioned in any of the review categories we're looking at, as it spreads into every facet of making the show. But we wanted to emphasize it early since it's such an easy yet powerful way to get fans to buy in and appreciate what they're watching. The costumes, props, music, all of it was great. But it's not exactly like they had to bring dragons to life. It's not too difficult to clothe the characters in contemporary clothing or litter this fantasy world with everyday objects we still use today. Nonetheless, it was all done well. Where the production really shined in our view was how they were able to depict how these real cities would look after being bombed and 20 years into a zombie outbreak. They all looked incredible, and it just sucks you into this world. And even though we hardly saw any, the infected also looked stunning. We talked about how good they looked after the second episode, and that quality remained for the few other times we ran into infected. The clickers, the bloater, even those who only had a mild infection, it all looked fantastic, and the actors did a great job bringing them to zombie life as well. Moving to the next section of review, let's talk about how The Last of Us did in upholding the existing lore, or more accurately, how faithful this adaptation was to the source material. As has been well documented, The Last of Us pulled almost every single scene critical to advancing the plot, twisting the plot, or developing relationships between characters directly from the game. Like word for word, nearly shot for shot from the game. The general storyline was the same, most of the characters were the same, and the main themes were the same. And for all the times we've taken issue with creators changing the lore with past shows, we have to give credit where credit is due, as The Last of Us was able to pull off a mostly faithful TV adaptation of a video game, something previously thought impossible. Now the keyword is mostly faithful. While the show got all of the major points down, it wasn't perfect. There were some minor deviations in recreating the events of the game that aren't a big deal and don't take away from the main story. For example, in the game, there was no concern that Tommy was in trouble and Joel needed to reach him. He simply set out with Tess and Ellie in order to do the job he was hired for, in delivering Ellie to the Fireflies. Or when Tess sacrifices herself to buy Joel and Ellie some time, it was actually Fedra who were hunting them, not the infected. And we actually saw that as an improvement over the original story, as it was a great way to introduce exactly how much of a threat the infected are and how they operate. But some changes were just indulgent, hollow pandering to get certain people barking like seals about the show on Twitter. Obviously, the biggest offender in this case was episode 3, where the story completely stopped so we can dedicate an hour to LGBT characters that serve no real purpose to the rest of the show. We thought that episode 3, aka the gay episode, was a well-told story and an artfully produced episode. But that doesn't mean it deserves to be told in this story. This little side quest that could have been a 10-minute flashback only served to get Joel and Ellie a truck, get Ellie a gun, and leave them with a lesson that, what? Life is hard in this zombie-infested wasteland? I think they already knew that after Tess blew herself to bits after a subpar makeout session. And this all constituted a significant deviation from the events of the game where Bill is very much alive, he and Frank did not have a storybook romance, and they didn't die lovingly in each other's arms. Now episode 7, aka the lesbian episode, is even more pointless than episode 3, but it was at least based off a playable DLC story to the original game, which we didn't realize at the time. And of course, some characters were race swapped, because it's current day and changing a character's exterior physical traits solves the current issue holding our society back. Now going off script isn't always bad though, and if done without interfering with other bits of existing lore, you can introduce some powerful world building. For example, learning about where the outbreak started and how it spread so quickly throughout the world was worth the deviation from the main story. It helped us better understand the world our characters have had to navigate, and it really helps fans buy into the overall fantasy. As far as the acting is concerned, we don't think this section warrants much discussion, which is generally a positive sign. We thought that most everyone pulled their weight in this regard, and the performances ranged from serviceable to great. However, not many characters stuck around for longer than an episode or two, so even if someone was killing it in their role, they were gone before the credits rolled and we weren't going to see them again. But even if you correct for that issue, there weren't any powerhouse performances in this show. With Joel and Ellie being in each and every episode, it's only right that they'll get the most focus here. Beginning with Joel, we'd say Pascal did well enough with what he was given, and at times it seems like he was bordering on doing a great job with the role. Now we take some issue with Joel's adaptation in this show versus the video game counterpart, but we suspect that's an issue on the creator's end, not the actor. Ellie is a different story though. We think that Ramsey gave it her all in trying to play Ellie, but it never really landed for us. She just didn't seem to capture the nuance and subtlety of Ellie that you get from the game. And looking ahead, we're not overly optimistic for Season 2 because her apparently limited acting range is going to have to be pushed even further for the events of the second game. But overall, we'd say she got through this season by the skin of her teeth, delivering a serviceable performance. And when working in scenes together, many of which were critical character development scenes, Pascal and Ramsey got through it fine, but we wouldn't go as far as to say they had great chemistry overall. To be fair though, they had big shoes to fill, as both Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson totally owned their roles in the game, and not many would be able to measure up to the high bar they set. Lastly, we come to the writing. As discussed previously, so much of the writing was pulled directly out of the game, so to save time, we can say that all of those parts of the show were fantastic. They were faithful to the source material, they generally carried the same weight as they did in the game story, and they fit this new adaptation without feeling like lazy copy-pasted scenes. Now, probably the worst aspect of the writing of this show was the pacing, an issue that was especially exacerbated by the 2 pointless side story episodes. A fair number of episodes just began to drag at times, and there definitely could have been some tightening up of the script to keep things moving forward. But our issue with the pacing is less with how each individual episode was paced, and more with how the season as a whole progressed. We already talked about how episode 3 could have been a 10-minute flashback with nothing lost in terms of the main story. Episode 7 could have been a 5-minute flashback, and even then you'd have a hard time justifying its inclusion. The show would have benefited far more with an extra 90 minutes spent on developing the relationship between Joel and Ellie as they traveled across a dangerous barren land, or getting more backstory on the characters they're about to run into, or even just simple world building. All of those are more impactful than learning that Ellie likes girls, or going through 20 years of this gay couple's life together to learn that they left Joel a spare key to their truck. As for Joel's character, there were some concerning cracks in this portrayal when compared to the video game counterpart. We stand by our opinion that Joel crying in this show was inconsistent with his character from the game, and that it could be a sign that they've chosen to base the Joel from the show on the Joel from the original game's sequel, The Last of Us Part 2. And if you're unaware of how Joel differs between the first game and the second, we'll let you look into it for yourself so we don't spoil anything for the second season. But we predict that quite a few people are going to have some serious problems with the Joel we'll get in the next season. If they stay true to the second game, of course. Another serious issue we took with the show was that it flubbed two critical reveals when you learn that Ellie and Sam are infected. For Ellie's infection reveal, the show was too focused on Joel's episode of PTSD to give any kind of weight to the fact that everyone who didn't play the game is just now learning that Ellie is infected. It's kind of a big deal to everyone but the creators of the show, apparently. And Sam's infection reveal was one of the dumbest things we've seen in a while, and we watched Velma. The shocking reveal of Sam's infection in the game was reduced to a laughable, nonsensical scene in the show where Ellie cuts her hand and tries to perform a low-tech blood transfusion, and then she just nods off to sleep without even thinking about mentioning this to one of the adults 10 feet away. And if you want to hear a really dumb take on why this scene played out the way it did, listen to the creators themselves talk about it in the post-episode feature. The show's version of this event was categorically worse than what we got in the game. Lastly, this series is following a little too closely in the footsteps of The Walking Dead in the sense that the zombies just come and go as the plot needs them to. The zombies that harass the characters at many points during the game were reduced to a couple appearances. Now, zombies aren't the focus of the story, and the creators got through this season well enough without too many run-ins with infected, but to a degree it serves to undermine the idea of this dangerous world they're living in. They seemingly pass 2,500 miles of open land where there's no real danger. Just stay away from big cities and you'll be fine. Hey, kinda sounds like our world. But that's an area the show could improve on in Season 2. Beyond all that, the show did well and even touched upon greatness here and there. The characters were interesting, the story was just about as good as the original, and they seemingly succeeded where all other video game adaptations have failed. As for rating this show, we're giving it an 80 out of 100. The score could have been higher, between 85 and 90, but when more than 20% of your season is worthless, you can't achieve those scores, simple as that. And in general, there were more good episodes than great episodes. The audience score as it stands right now is 89%, which we think is overly generous, but our view of the show is at least in the same ballpark. Even at an 80, The Last of Us scores a Great Watch designation from us, meaning that we think it's worth your time. Casual viewers will be treated to an incredible story, and fans of the game will be satisfied with the show's faithfulness to what they already know and love. That being said, as you can probably tell, we're not super optimistic about future seasons of the show. Going into this series, we had hoped that the second season wouldn't immediately go into the events of the second game, but it sounds like that's their plan, and they don't have any real intention of creating any new story for the main characters that's not in one of the two games. We think that's a missed opportunity that limits the ceiling for this show, but that's what they're gonna do. Either way, Great Watch or Hate Watch, we'll be here to cover that second season when it arrives. What did you think about this first season of The Last of Us? If you were familiar with the game beforehand, did that prior knowledge make you enjoy the show more, or did you find yourself using it to criticize the show? What was your least favorite episode, and why was it episode 7? Let us know in the comments below. Please remember to like the video if you liked it, and click the subscribe button down below for reviews of other current shows and movies. Thank you for joining us, and we'll catch you on the next one.